we're making former heroes who are complicated to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
I understand more than I do, but yet we have to make them now villains. And what's all interesting is that I think we can call the 1619 project kind of a very political document, because oftentimes it goes into comparing what's happened in history as resulting of political disagreements today. But in addition to that, it really makes it basically really makes this kind of impact of trying to be radical politically. The document, and for whatever reason, in the United States, for at least since the last 50 years, and you may even find evidence that it's even happened longer than that, in some sense, that they want to go after, like, there's something about going after the founding, going after the revolution itself, and finding some way to discredit it in some way, to make it feel in some way illegitimate. And that's something that feels like they just got after so much, that so many radicals in the United States have. And I feel this is another attempt.
Yeah, and, Michael Malice makes a point kind of like this, where I'm paraphrasing, I don't think he would mind. He says something to the point that progressivism, in all of its anti-Americanness, is as American as apple pie. It's that old. It goes back at least to Woodrow Wilson.
Well, that's actually who I was thinking of. I'm talking about, it could have been Woodrow Wilson was probably the first one I can think of who just wanted to redefine what the founding meant, or basically just felt like the founding wasn't legitimate enough.
I think maybe it started with Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
Yeah, I think he was the first sort of imperial president, not counting Lincoln. And Lincoln, it was because of, circumstances. And I have my own criticisms of Lincoln.
Sure. Yeah.
Less so for the ones you were talking about earlier, as much as for, I understand the war powers argument and all that. But when you're throwing journalists and politicians in the North in prison for what they say.
Right.
If I heard criticisms of Lincoln and it was that, then I would understand it a lot more. But it's never that stuff. But yeah, I think TR was the first like imperial presidency, and then Woodrow Wilson combined that with this sort of, he was from academia. He was the first academic who became president. He had been, president or dean of Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he had a very, it was a very turn of the 20th century, progressivist, look at, we're beyond the founders now. We're beyond the Constitution. Right. That stuff is quaint. Because he didn't like, the government being restrained.
Right.
Yeah. And so much that's come out of that ever since then. And then on the other side of that, when you said, maybe there are examples that go even farther back than 50 years ago, I would say on the journalistic end, Walter Duranty, what was that, the 1930s, the 1940s? He was a writer, here we go again, for the New York Times, who went to the Soviet Union and decided on his own volition to not talk about the atrocities he saw. He came back and he decided to write about how wonderful Stalinism was.
Right.
And this was a writer for the New York Times. So, why do that unless you have an agenda?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the 30s especially was a crazy time where a lot of bad ideas were being really, seriously considered. Thank goodness for Solzhenitsyn on that one.
Indeed.
For the most part. But the thing is that I agree, the progressive era, particularly with Roosevelt and then with Woodrow Wilson, is this. I feel like that's when you had a flip and how we started viewing the Constitution. And I might be even quoting you on this. If I'm wrong, let me know. But it's almost like Roosevelt started this, and then Wilson kind of went even further in the sense that the Constitution is about it is not full on written that the government can't do it, then it can. And it used to be the opposite of government only did what the Constitution. That was that major shift in the interpretation that we're still dealing with to this day.
Right.
It came from that era. It came from the Roosevelt-Wilson era.
And that shift was also, it's not just that Wilson came out of academia and became a politician, but also the sort of Marxist approach to history within American scholarship also happened around that time. This historian Charles Beard, he looms large in the scholarship of United States history. He wrote his most famous work. It's called An Economic Thesis of the Constitution. Economic thesis because it's Marxist. Now, I don't know that he ever called himself a Marxist, but everybody, whether they agree with him or don't agree with him, would agree that he basically popularized the Marxist lens upon American history. His whole thesis was, and this was in 1915, or right around there. I might be off by a year or two. Okay. But it was right in that progressive era, and his economic thesis was that the Constitution was basically a conspiracy of the moneyed interests of the founders. And so he basically cast the Federalists as the moneyed commercial interests and the Anti-Federalists as the more sort of egalitarian yeoman farmers and all this. And many historians have criticized his rather simplistic view. Simplistic because that framework doesn't quite work, and also just because there may have been an economic interest among, the participants, to act as though that was the only interest is absurd. So it's kind of reductionist, but it was nevertheless really influential. So, and until Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood in the middle of the 20th century, Charles Beard's approach to American history was basically the most popular form of academic history of the United States. So we're talking, and that's the first half of the 20th century.
That's fascinating.
We don't think about the first half of the 20th century as being Marxist in academia, but in the field of history it was.
That's crazy.